On the Grand Canal of Venice, in a palazzo that was never completed, one of the 20th century's most scandalous women took her final breath. Peggy Guggenheim, heiress, libertine, savior of modern art, died as she had lived, surrounded by beauty she could possess but never quite hold. December 23, 1979. The mist that rises from the Venetian lagoon in winter is not merely weather, it is a shroud. It clings to the ancient stone of the sinking city, muffling the bells of San Marco and turning the water of the Grand Canal into a sheet of hammered lead. On this particular evening, that spectral fog seemed to thicken around one specific address, a low, white structure that sits awkwardly among the soaring Gothic arches and Baroque fantasies of its towering neighbors. This is the Palazzo Venier dei Leoni, known to locals simply as the Palazzo Non Finito, the unfinished palace. It is a building that was intended to rise 4 stories into the Italian sky, yet it stopped abruptly at the first floor, cut off at the knees, a stump of white limestone left to weather the centuries. A perfect architectural metaphor for the woman who had made it her sanctuary. Inside, the silence was heavier than the stone itself. The marble floors caught the last fragments of daylight, filtering through tall windows that faced the canal, the veined stone gleaming like ice, reflecting nothing but emptiness now. The air held the lingering scent of expensive tobacco and the musk of small dogs, but the life force that had animated this strange fortress for 30 years had finally been extinguished. The rooms were not large by Venetian standards, but they were dense with color, with history, with the echoes of lives that had collided here in brief, brilliant flashes before scattering like fragments of a cubist painting. On the walls, canvases formed an unerring, silent assembly of 20th century genius. Jackson Pollock's chaotic drips pulsed with kinetic energy, frozen explosions of paint that captured movement in perpetual suspension. Picasso's fractured faces stared from their frames with geometric intensity, eyes displaced and multiplied, seeing everything and nothing simultaneously. Dal's melting clocks draped over barren landscapes, time itself rendered meaningless, liquefied, absurd. Kandinsky's abstract symphonies sang in colors that had no names. Braque's guitars deconstructed and reassembled themselves in impossible dimensions. Every inch of wall space held a masterpiece, each one worth a fortune that could ransom kingdoms, and together they formed a collection that represented nothing less than the salvation of modern art itself. The signs of recent occupancy were painfully present, frozen in the amber of sudden absence. An empty silk cushion on a low modernist chair, slightly indented, as if someone had just shifted their weight and stepped away. A wine glass on a marble side table, containing the last red trace of burgundy clinging to crystal like a crimson ghost. A book left open, its spine resigned, as though expecting to be resumed at any moment. These were the artifacts of a life interrupted, not concluded. Near the window that overlooked the canal, a wheelchair sat abandoned at an angle, positioned as though its occupant had grown tired not of Venice, but of remembering she had once walked freely through the galleries of Paris, the salons of New York, the studios of London. On a small lacquered table beside it lay the instruments of her final years, thick dark-rimmed spectacles that had become increasingly necessary as her vision dimmed, and a small hearing aid that would amplify silence no longer. These prosthetics of age looked almost absurd against the audacity of the art surrounding them. Remnants of a woman who had once dominated every room she entered, reduced to needing the world amplified and magnified just to participate in it. Along one wall, a series of hooks held leather collars of various sizes, each bearing a small brass nameplate. These were not the accessories of lovers or the remnants of some scandalous game, but something far more poignant, the collars of her Lhasa Apsos, the creatures who had provided more consistent companionship than any of the dozens of men who had passed through her bed and her life. 14 of them were already buried in the palazzo's garden, their graves marked with the same care she had given to the placement of her Pollocks and Picassos. Soon she would join them, her ashes interred among the only beings who had loved her, without complication, without agenda, without the corrosive need to possess or be possessed in return. The profound irony of her situation was inescapable. She was born into one of America's wealthiest dynasties, a granddaughter of the Copper Kings who had extracted fortunes from the mountains of Colorado and transformed raw ore into an empire of almost unimaginable scale. The Guggenheim name meant power, meant museums, meant the kind of generational wealth that was supposed to insulate its inheritors from every conceivable tragedy. Her ancestors had gouged copper from mountains and conjured opulence from ore, believing that enough capital could conquer geography, industry, even nature itself. Yet she died, nearly deaf, half-blind, and profoundly alone in this truncated palace on the edge of the Adriatic, in a rented country, in an unfinished house, surrounded by things that could not love her back. Her lovers were already gone, scattered across the decades like the fragments of her own fractured existence. Some had died young, consumed by alcohol or despair, or the particular madness that afflicts those who mistake intensity for meaning. Others had simply moved on, finding younger women, saner women, women who did not collect them like objects dart, and then grow bored when the novelty faded. A few lingered in institutions, their brilliant minds fractured beyond repair, their names appearing in her journals and letters like ghosts haunting the margins of history. Lawrence Vail, the volatile dadaist who had beaten her and humiliated her publicly. John Holmes, the tortured writer whose sudden death had gouged an invisible wound. Samuel Beckett, the ascetic genius who had refused her money, then refused her bed, then left with his art intact and his heart untroubled. Max Ernst, whose blue eyes and mythic ego had drawn her into a marriage that dissolved into yet another abandonment. Her daughter was gone too, though in a way that cut deeper than any romantic dissolution ever could. Pegeen had died young, too young, her death shadowed by questions that Peggy could never bring herself to fully answer. The guilt sat in the palazzo like another piece of art, invisible but omnipresent, a weight that no amount of Picasso's could balance. The paintings watched it all in frozen silence, witnesses to a life of magnificent ruin. They had seen her rage and weep and laugh with a freedom that terrified conventional society. They had seen her write checks that saved careers and changed the course of modern art. They had seen her grow old in this sanctuary, her body failing while her collection only grew more valuable, more significant, more permanent. They were worth more than most European kingdoms now. These canvases she had acquired for almost nothing during the chaos of war and its aftermath. They would outlast her name, outlast her scandals, outlast even the memory of her face. The unfinished nature of her palazzo was the ultimate symbol of her existence. Nothing was ever quite resolved. The love affairs never settled into domestic peace. The relationship with her mother never healed. The recognition she craved from her haughty uncles in New York came too late and with too much condescension. She was a woman of fragments, holding on to pieces of brilliance, a canvas here, a sculpture there, a memory of a night in Montparnasse, trying to assemble a whole picture that refused to cohere. As the gondolas drifted silently past her darkened windows that night, carrying tourists who knew nothing of the drama that had played out behind those white walls, the irony was complete. She had bought the art to save it from the Nazis, to save it from obscurity, to save it from the trash heap of history. She had succeeded. The art was safe. But the woman herself had been trying to save herself, using every dollar, every painting, every lover as a frantic bid for survival. A way to prove that she existed, that she mattered, that she was real. To understand how a shy, awkward girl from a fractured dynasty became the woman in the unfinished sanctuary, we must return to the night the ocean swallowed her father, and with him, the illusion that money could keep anyone safe. Peggy Guggenheim was born on August 26, 1898, into a gilded fortress. Her grandfather had transformed copper ore into an American dynasty. Her father, Benjamin Guggenheim, possessed the family fortune but not its discipline. To understand the magnitude of the world she entered, one must first comprehend the violent alchemy that created it. Meyer Guggenheim had arrived in America as a Swiss immigrant with little more than ambition weighing down his pockets. The America of the mid-19th century was merciless to the poor and generous to the ruthless, and Meyer adapted with the swift cunning of a man who understood that sentiment was a luxury he could not afford. What others saw as worthless mountainsides scarred by failed ventures, he recognized as veins of copper waiting to bleed wealth. In the brutal landscape of Colorado, he purchased abandoned mines that previous owners had surrendered to bankruptcy and despair. With a combination of industrial vision and calculated cruelty that would become the family signature, he transformed those ghost towns into rivers of molten profit. The smelting plants that rose against the western horizon were like industrial cathedrals, belching smoke and sulfur into the sky, spitting out ingots that would wire America's cities and power its factories. The mountains themselves seemed to hemorrhage under Meyer's relentless extraction, their copper arteries flowing directly into the Guggenheim coffers. By the time Peggy was born, Guggenheim copper was electrifying the continent. Every telephone wire, every electric light, every industrial machine depended on metal hauled from the earth by anonymous men whose names would never appear in society pages, but whose labor built palaces on Fifth Avenue. The Guggenheims had become a species of American aristocracy, though the established families initially refused to acknowledge Jewish industrialists as anything more than wealthy upstarts. They constructed townhouses that rivaled the Vanderbilt mansions, hosted dinners where crystal chimed like temple bells, and spoke in the multiple languages of international commerce. Their fortune was not old in the European sense. It had not trickled through centuries of careful inheritance. Instead, it had erupted with volcanic force over a few decades, propelled by sweat, fire, and an almost religious conviction that the world existed to be reshaped by those bold enough to claim dominion over it. But Peggy's lineage was more complicated than simple industrial might. She existed at the collision point of two incompatible Jewish dynasties, each viewing the other with barely concealed disdain. On her father's side were the Guggenheims, copper kings, aggressive industrialists whose wealth still carried the acrid smell of the smelters from which it was extracted. They were new money, unashamed of their origins, expanding their empire with the ruthless efficiency of men who had learned that sentiment was the enemy of success. On her mother's side were the Seligmans, banking royalty who had been established in New York since before the Civil War, financial aristocrats who viewed the Guggenheims as vulgar parvenus who had arrived late to the ball, inappropriately dressed but impossible to ignore. Florette Seligman had married Benjamin Guggenheim in a union designed to merge industrial power with financial refinement. Instead, it produced a household characterized by mutual disappointment and emotional glaciation. Florette was a woman of peculiar compulsions, known to repeat phrases 3 times in succession, a nervous tic that unnerved dinner guests and terrorized her children. She was beautiful in the brittle manner of women who understood that beauty was currency, and she measured her daughters against the same merciless standard by which she evaluated herself. Her coldness was not mere indifference, but a cultivated art form, a way of maintaining control in a world where women of her class possessed influence only through the careful management of appearances. Benjamin, by contrast, was the esthete among industrialists, the dilettante among empire builders. He was charming, cultured, sophisticated in the way that men of inherited wealth often are. He knew wine, art, music, all the signifiers of refinement that were supposed to distinguish the Guggenheims from mere millionaires. But he was fundamentally unreliable, a man who treated his marriage vows as suggestions rather than commandments, who spent more time in Paris with his mistresses than in New York with his family. He possessed the family fortune but lacked the hunger that had created it, preferring the opera to board meetings and European salons to Colorado mining camps. Into this collision of copper and capital, ore and credit, came Marguerite Peggy Guggenheim, the middle daughter who would occupy an uncomfortable position between dynasties, between sisters, between two visions of what a woman bearing that name should become. It was a cruel trick of genetics that in a family where wealth could purchase almost anything, it could not purchase beauty for every child. Her elder sister Benita and younger sister Hazel possessed the delicate features that society worshipped. But Peggy was plain. Not grotesque, not deformed, simply unremarkable. Perhaps the worst possible insult in a world that prized appearances above all else. Her nose was too prominent, her teeth too visible, her manner too intense. She listened more than she spoke, developing the habit of watching rather than participating, storing away observations that would later inform her understanding of human nature, but did nothing to ease her childhood isolation. Her mother's disappointment was palpable, expressed through constant corrections of posture, clothing, and voice, but never through the fundamental acceptance that Peggy craved. Fleurette viewed her middle daughter as a genetic betrayal, a reflection of some failure in her own, carefully maintained perfection. The coldness between them would never truly thaw, creating a wound that would drive Peggy to seek validation in increasingly desperate and self-destructive ways throughout her life. The outward circumstances of her childhood were as opulent as any fairy tale. The family townhouse on East 72nd Street was less a home than a museum of Victorian excess, its rooms dark and heavy with mahogany furniture, velvet drapes that blocked out the democratic sunlight, and servants who moved through the corridors like shadows. Persian rugs softened marble floors, silk damask covered walls, and portraits of ancestors who had only recently ceased being peasants hung in gilt frames like evidence of rapid social ascension. There were French governesses and private tutors, a regiment of invisible hands that smoothed every potential discomfort before it could disturb the family's carefully orchestrated existence. Yet this fortress of wealth, designed to protect the Guggenheims from scandal and intrusion, also imprisoned them within a suffocating atmosphere of expectation and surveillance. Peggy was educated not in the chaotic democracy of classrooms, but in the sterile environment of private instruction, learning French before she could properly navigate the social geography of her own city. The curriculum was an elegantly curated mixture of languages, literature, music, and the silent art of social maneuvering, everything designed to make her ornamental rather than essential, interesting enough to decorate a man's life, but never so intense as to disrupt its comfortable trajectory. The family traveled like royalty, moving between New York, Paris, and the grand hotels of Europe in caravans of trunks and servants. But for Peggy, these journeys were exercises in mobile confinement. She observed the world through the windows of private train cars and hotel suites, always separated from the vitality of real life by the invisible barrier of her class. She saw the great museums of Europe, dragged through the Louvre and the Uffizi by dutiful parents who viewed art as cultural obligation rather than passion. The beauty of the old world was always mediated, filtered through the expectations of her station, admired from a distance that wealth imposed rather than chose. Despite the luxury, or perhaps because of it, Peggy was profoundly lonely. The emotional architecture of her childhood was defined by absence and inadequacy. Her father was charming but distant, more interested in his Parisian adventures than in the awkward daughter who adored him with desperate intensity. Benjamin represented everything she longed for: approval, attention, love, and everything she could not quite reach. When he was present, he brought gifts and stories that made her feel momentarily special. But his absences were frequent and prolonged, teaching her that love was something you waited for, something that arrived on schedules determined by men, something that could be withdrawn without explanation. Or appeal. Her uncles were busy constructing monuments to their own egos. Solomon was already dreaming of the museum that would eventually bear his name. But they had little time for the shy niece with the watchful eyes. She was a minor character in the grand epic of Guggenheim Ascension, a footnote in the ledger of their success. While they built temples to already canonized art, safe and respectable collections that reassured rather than disturbed, Peggy absorbed the lesson that her role was not to become someone, but to attract someone, the right husband, from the right family, whose name would link properly with her own. In the society pages, the fortress that protected her also taught her that authentic connection was dangerous, that vulnerability was weakness, that the price of security was the surrender of spontaneity. She learned to flee inward, finding in books the companionship that eluded her in drawing rooms. Ideas became more dependable than people, imagination more trustworthy than experience. Yet even here she was constrained by the invisible boundaries of class and gender. Certain subjects remained off limits for young ladies. Certain questions about power and justice were not placed within her reach. By 1912, the family had settled into a rhythm that seemed as permanent as the copper deposits that funded it. They were wealthy beyond the dreams of avarice, respected if not entirely accepted by the old guard, and apparently secure in their position at the apex of American society. The world of 1912 was a world of supreme confidence, the height of an age when technology and industry seemed to promise unlimited progress. Ocean liners grew larger, buildings stretched higher, and fortunes expanded without apparent limit. The idea that something could go catastrophically wrong was foreign to a girl raised in the hermetic safety of the Guggenheim bubble. Peggy was 13 years old that spring, on the cusp of womanhood, still awkward and plain, but beginning to develop the intellectual curiosity that would eventually define her. She read voraciously, devouring books that hinted at worlds beyond the velvet curtains of her existence. She sensed, with the intuition of youth, that there was more to life than the endless cycle of dress fittings and social maneuvering that consumed her mother's days. She was waiting for her transformation, believing with naive certainty that her time would come, that the fortress of her family's wealth would eventually become a palace of possibilities rather than a prison of expectations. She believed she was safe. The foundation of her world seemed as solid as the mountains from which her grandfather had extracted his fortune. Disaster was something that happened to other people, to the poor, to the unlucky. It did not happen to families who lived in townhouses on the Upper East Side, who traveled in private railway cars, who wore pearls the size of grapes. The Guggenheim name was supposed to be insurance against ordinary catastrophe, a talisman that would protect its bearers from the chaos that consumed common lives. But the security she felt was an illusion, a thin veneer of civilization stretched over the fundamental uncertainty of existence. The wealth that cushioned her life had been extracted through risk, through exploitation, through the brutal realities of industrial capitalism that were carefully hidden from the daughters of dynasties. And her father, the man who represented everything she loved and everything she hoped to become, was about to make a choice that would shatter that illusion forever. Benjamin was in Europe again that spring, ostensibly on business, but actually pursuing the life of a bon vivant in the salons of Paris. He had been there for months, living with his mistress while his family waited in New York for his return. He was due back in April, and he had booked passage on a new ship that was the marvel of the age, the largest moving object ever constructed by human hands, a floating palace that promised to bring the luxury of the finest hotels to the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. But on April 15, 1912, when Peggy was just 13 years old, the fortress would crack open, and the tragedy that followed would haunt her for the rest of her life, driving her into the arms of dozens of men, each one a ghost of the father who never came home. Benjamin Guggenheim was aboard the Titanic with his mistress when the ship struck the iceberg. He was not with his wife. He was not with his daughters. He was, as always, chasing pleasure in the face of catastrophe. The Royal Mailship Titanic was more than a vessel. It was an argument made manifest in steel and rivets. It argued that human ingenuity had finally conquered the ancient terror of the sea, that wealth and engineering could purchase immunity from the fundamental laws of nature. Stretching 882 feet from bow to stern and displacing 46,000 tons of seawater, it was the largest moving object ever constructed by human hands. The White Star Line had marketed it as unsinkable, a claim that reflected the supreme arrogance of an age that believed money could solve any problem, overcome any obstacle, defy even death itself. Benjamin had boarded at Cherbourg on April 10, 1912, accompanied by his French mistress Leontine Aubart, a 24-year-old singer whose existence his family in New York pretended not to acknowledge. She possessed moderate talent but exceptional beauty, understanding intuitively that her value lay not in what she could create, but in how she could ornament a wealthy man's carefully curated existence. They occupied adjoining first-class staterooms, maintaining the fiction of propriety, while everyone aboard understood the true nature of their arrangement. Benjamin traveled with his valet, Victor Giglio, and Leontine brought her maid, Emma Skesser, creating a small entourage that moved through the ship's gilded corridors like minor royalty in exile. The Titanic's first-class accommodations were designed to make passengers forget they were at sea at all. The grand staircase descended through multiple decks beneath an ornate glass dome, its oak panels carved with cherubs and garlands, its balustrades gleaming with polished brass that caught the light from electric chandeliers. The dining saloon could seat 500 guests beneath elaborate plasterwork ceilings, its tables set with Wedgwood china and crystal that chimed like temple bells when the ship rolled gently in the swells. There was a Turkish bath decorated with blue-green tiles and gilded columns, a swimming pool tiled in pristine white and blue, a squash court, a gymnasium with the latest exercise machines, and a smoking room paneled in mahogany where men could retreat to discuss business and politics while there. Wives performed the elaborate social rituals that justified their existence. Benjamin moved through these spaces with the practiced ease of a man who had never encountered a luxury he could not afford. At 46, he was handsome in the manner of men who have never worked with their hands, his mustache waxed to aristocratic points, his evening clothes tailored on Savile Row. He embodied a particular species of wealthy man, cultured enough to appreciate beauty, sophisticated enough to navigate European society, but fundamentally unserious, treating life as an extended aesthetic experience rather than a moral challenge requiring difficult choices. The night of April 14th was cold and crystalline, the kind of darkness that occurs far from land when the moon is absent and the stars multiply into infinity. The North Atlantic was unnaturally calm, a mirror of black glass that made it more difficult to spot dangers ahead because there were no waves breaking against obstacles to reveal their presence. The Titanic was racing westward at nearly 23 knots, maintaining speed despite multiple ice warnings received throughout the day. The air temperature was dropping steadily toward freezing, but inside the first-class dining saloon, the atmosphere remained warm and convivial, scented with expensive tobacco, French perfume, and the rich aromas of roasted meats and heavy sauces. At 11:40 that night, Frederick Fleet, the lookout in the crow's nest, saw something emerge from the darkness ahead, a dark mass that resolved into the jagged silhouette of an iceberg directly in the ship's path. He rang the warning bell 3 times and telephoned the bridge, but the ship was too large, too fast, too committed to its trajectory to avoid collision. First Officer William Murdoch ordered the engines reversed, and the helm turned hard to port, but the Titanic required nearly half a mile to execute such a maneuver. The ship began to turn, slowly, ponderously, but not quickly enough. The impact, when it came, was almost anticlimactic, There was no explosive crash, no dramatic lurch that threw passengers from their beds. Instead, the iceberg scraped along the starboard side below the waterline, opening a series of gashes that extended nearly 300 feet along the hull. The sound was peculiar, a grinding, tearing noise like metal being slowly ripped, accompanied by a shudder that passengers in first class barely noticed. It was the sound of the impossible happening, of an unsinkable ship meeting an immovable object, though few realized the mathematics of survival had already shifted irrevocably in favor of the sea. Benjamin was asleep when the collision occurred, awakened by the cessation of the engines and the strange stillness that followed. Summoned from his stateroom by a steward, he dressed warmly, sensing perhaps that stillness was more dangerous than any storm. He went on deck, observed the crew uncovering the lifeboats with unusual haste, and returned to wake his mistress and her maid. He ensured they were dressed warmly, escorted them to the boat deck, and helped them into lifeboat number 9. Speaking to Lontine in German, he said, "We will soon see each other again. It's just a repair. Tomorrow the Titanic will go on again." It was a lie, or perhaps a desperate hope, but it was the last time she would ever see him alive. Once the women were safely away, Benjamin Guggenheim did something that would become legendary, a gesture of such profound vanity and arrogance that it would be mythologized for more than a century. He did not fight for a place on a lifeboat. He did not attempt to bribe a crewman or scramble for debris. He did not panic or plead or display any of the desperate animal instincts that catastrophe typically unleashes. Instead, he returned to his stateroom with his valet. They removed their heavy sweaters and lifebelts. They washed, shaved, and dressed in their finest evening wear: white tie, tailcoat, pearl studs, patent leather shoes polished to mirror brightness. They emerged onto the tilting deck, looking like men prepared for an opera gala rather than a freezing death in the middle of the Atlantic. When a steward asked why he had removed his lifebelt, Benjamin delivered the line that would define his legacy: "We've dressed in our best and are prepared to go down like gentlemen." He then asked the steward to deliver a message to his wife in New York. "Should the man survive, tell her I played the game out straight to the end. No woman shall be left aboard this ship, because Ben Guggenheim was a coward. It was pure performance, magnificent, fatal theater." Faced with the raw, chaotic reality of death, Benjamin chose to retreat into the armor of his class. He chose etiquette over survival, dignity over desperate struggle, aesthetic gesture over any frantic attempt to preserve his life. He stood on the deck, smoking a cigar and drinking brandy while the band played, and screams began to rise from the freezing water. He had transformed his own death into a carefully choreographed demonstration of aristocratic superiority, more concerned with how he would be remembered than with whether he would survive to be remembered at all. At 2:20 in the morning on April 15, 1912, the great ship broke apart and plunged into the abyss, taking Benjamin Guggenheim with it into 2 miles of freezing darkness. His body was never recovered, claimed by the same ocean that had swallowed his arrogance, his sophistication, his carefully cultivated performance of upper-class invincibility. For 13-year-old Peggy, waiting in the family townhouse on East 72nd Street, the news was a devastation that transcended simple grief. The loss of a father is traumatic for any child, but the manner of Benjamin's death inflicted a specific, complex psychological wound that would never heal. The narrative presented to the world was one of heroism, the noble gentleman stepping aside for women and children, meeting death with dignity and grace. But to the daughter left behind, the subtext was far darker and more personal. Her father had been with another woman when he died. He had been away from his family by choice, pursuing pleasure while his daughters waited for his return. And in his final moments, he had chosen a stoic, performative death over the desperate, messy struggle to return to the children who adored him. This realization cracked open the armor of her universe with devastating finality. Peggy discovered, with brutal clarity, that even Guggenheims could drown. The steel walls of the Titanic were supposed to be invulnerable, just as the fortress of her family's wealth was supposed to be impenetrable. Both had failed with shocking completeness. The money, the status, the name, none of it had saved him. The ocean did not care about copper mines, or bank accounts, or aristocratic bloodlines. It simply took him, as indifferently as it would take a steerage passenger or a crew member or anyone else who happened to be aboard when the mathematics of survival shifted in favor of the abyss. This abandonment planted a seed of profound insecurity in Peggy's heart that would grow and metastasize throughout her life. If the most powerful man in her world could simply vanish, swallowed by the cold indifference of the sea, then nothing was permanent, nothing was safe. No relationship could be trusted to endure. This terrifying revelation fundamentally rewired her understanding of attachment and possession. She began to comprehend that people were fragile, transient entities who could leave you without warning. They could die. They could choose mistresses over daughters and vanity over survival. They could dress for death instead of fighting for life. This trauma birthed a deep, frantic need to possess things that could not abandon her. If people were unreliable, perhaps objects were not. If a father could drown in evening dress, perhaps a painting could be saved from the flames of war. This was the genesis of the obsessive collector she would become, a woman who surrounded herself with tangible, physical beauty, because beauty frozen in paint or bronze could not walk out the door, could not change its mind, could not choose a mistress over a daughter, could not sink into the Atlantic while performing aristocratic gestures. The shadow of Benjamin's death also warped her understanding of love itself. She would spend the rest of her life unconsciously seeking him, trying to resolve the trauma of his abandonment by reenacting it with other men. She would be drawn repeatedly to older men, difficult men, men of genius and arrogance, who possessed the same charismatic distance her father had embodied. She would seek out artists and writers who were emotionally unavailable, men who would inevitably hurt her, because that pain felt familiar. It felt like love. She was trying to rewrite the ending of the Titanic story, trying to find a man who would choose her over his own vanity, even as she compulsively selected men who were constitutionally incapable of making that choice. The arrogance of Benjamin's final moments, the dressing up, the brandy, the refusal to fight, also imprinted itself on her psyche like a template for facing disaster. It taught her a twisted lesson about style in the face of catastrophe. If you cannot stop the disaster from occurring, you must at least look magnificent while it destroys you. This would become Peggy's own survival strategy throughout her life. When faced with war, heartbreak, scandal, or social ostracism, she would armor herself in eccentricity and defiant style. She would wear mismatched earrings while critics mocked her taste. She would buy art while Nazi tanks rolled toward Paris. She would face the world with a performative bravery that echoed the father standing on the tilting deck in his white tie and tails. In the immediate aftermath, the Guggenheim family retreated into mourning, but for Peggy, the silence was deafening. The golden era of her childhood was definitively over. The fortress of wealth and privilege that had seemed so permanent had been breached not by financial ruin or social scandal, but by something far more fundamental, the simple, brutal fact that even the richest men could drown. Her mother, Fleurette, retreated further into her neurotic compulsions, her repetitive speech patterns worsening, her emotional coldness deepening into something approaching Arctic indifference. The house on East 72nd Street became a mausoleum, haunted by the ghost of the man who had chosen to die like a gentleman rather than live as a father. Peggy was left with a trust fund and an abyss. She had money, millions of dollars that would become available when she came of age, but she had no guidance, no model for how to live with the knowledge that safety was an illusion. The uncles who ran the family business viewed her with a mixture of pity and irrelevance. She was just Benjamin's plain daughter, a tragic footnote to a great disaster, expected to eventually marry a respectable banker and disappear into the quiet obscurity of upper-class matronhood. But the crack in her armor was too wide to be sealed by conventional expectations. The illusion of safety had been shattered so completely that she could never again believe in the promises of stability offered by wealth or social position. She began to understand that the only honest response to the absurdity of death was to live with equal absurdity. The only way to combat the silence of the ocean was to make as much noise as possible. She started to chafe against the restrictions of her class, the suffocating atmosphere of proper behavior and appropriate choices. The tragedy of the Titanic had stripped her of her father, but it had also stripped her of her fear. What was there left to be afraid of? The worst had already happened. The unsinkable had sunk. The king was dead. And in the vacuum of his absence, a strange, terrible freedom began to bloom. She realized she owed nothing to the society that had produced her father only to let him drown in his own arrogance. She owed nothing to the rules of a world that made no sense, where good men died for the sake of appearance while their children were left to make sense of the wreckage. When her inheritance finally came of age, Peggy could have chosen safety, a Fifth Avenue husband, a respectable set of pearls, a dutiful life cushioned by the remaining family fortune. It would have been the sensible choice, the choice her mother wanted, the choice her uncles expected. But the ghost of Benjamin Guggenheim, standing on the deck in his white tie while the ship tilted toward eternity, whispered a different imperative. Instead, she crossed the Atlantic, straight into the arms of Paris, the avant-garde, and a world that would devour and immortalize her in equal measure. By the 1920s, Peggy Guggenheim had fled America for Europe, and she was collecting two things with equal fervor: modern art and modern men. Both would prove equally dangerous to possess. Paris in the years after the Great War was a city of deliberate forgetting, a place where the survivors of industrial slaughter came to anesthetize themselves with beauty, absurdity, and excess. The cafes of Montparnasse became laboratories of cultural revolution, their marble-topped tables sticky with spilled absinthe and scattered with manifestos declaring the death of everything that had come before. The Demi, the Rotonde, the Select, these were not merely establishments serving coffee and wine, but sanctuaries where expatriates and artists constructed new identities from the wreckage of the old world. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and arguments conducted in multiple languages, debates about whether painting should represent anything at all, whether words could capture reality or only expose its fundamental absurdity. Peggy arrived in this intoxicating chaos not as a tourist, but as an escapee, fleeing a city that had already decided who she was supposed to be. In New York, she was a Guggenheim daughter, a future social ornament destined to marry within her caste and reproduce its values. In Paris, she was simply Peggy, an American with money, a hunger for experience, and a face no one had seen in the society columns. The anonymity was intoxicating. She was 23 years old, possessing a nose she detested, a fortune she barely understood, and a hunger for experience that was less an appetite than a form of starvation. She was desperate for validation, for love, for proof that she was more than just a plain-faced heiress whose father had chosen evening dress over survival. She gravitated immediately to the bohemian circles that clustered around the left bank, drawn by the same instinct that leads the wounded toward others who understand suffering. Here she met Lawrence Vale, the self-proclaimed King of Bohemia, a volatile American writer and dadaist who embodied everything her upbringing had taught her to avoid. He was handsome in a dissolute way, golden-haired and theatrical, prone to sudden rages and equally sudden declarations of devotion. He drank excessively, wrote sporadically, and possessed the kind of charisma that certain damaged women mistake for depth. In a society where most artists could barely pay for lunch, Peggy's inheritance functioned like a magnet and a curse. Money has its own aesthetic power, and men noticed her. They commented on her nose, then on her generosity, then on her bed. They married in 1922 in a ceremony that scandalized her family and delighted the expatriate gossips. What followed was not a marriage but a prolonged education in humiliation. Vale was physically abusive, his violence erupting without warning or pattern, transforming dinner parties into crime scenes and romantic evenings into emergency room visits. In crowded restaurants, he would rub jam into her hair while their friends watched in frozen silence. He would throw her downstairs or hold her head underwater in the bathtub until her lungs burned for air, releasing her only at the last possible second. He mocked her appearance, called her the least beautiful of three sisters to her face, and yet she clung to him with a masochistic tenacity that baffled her friends. The psychological architecture of this abuse was complex and self-reinforcing. Peggy had been raised to believe that her plainness made her unworthy of genuine love, that any man who chose her was doing her a favor she could never adequately repay. When Vale struck her, some twisted part of her psyche interpreted the violence as proof of passion, evidence that she mattered enough to provoke such intense reactions. She endured because she believed, with tragic conviction, that suffering was the price of being seen. She had internalized the idea that she was unlovable, and therefore, the violence was merely the tax she had to pay for being allowed to exist in the presence of such brilliant men. If her father had chosen death over returning to her, perhaps violent attention was better than no attention at all. The beatings became a perverse form of validation, confirmation that she existed, that she could affect someone deeply enough to inspire such rage. When Vale finally left her in 1930 for another woman, the abandonment was simultaneously devastating and liberating. She was free, but freedom only intensified the fundamental question that had haunted her since the Titanic sank. What was she without someone to validate her existence? The answer she found was to accelerate the pattern rather than break it. She moved through lovers with increasing velocity, each affair a desperate attempt to fill the void that had opened in her chest when her father chose evening dress over survival. John Holmes became her next obsession, an English writer of considerable intellect and negligible output who drank himself into philosophical paralysis while Peggy watched with adoring patience. He represented the father she had lost, older, cultured, emotionally unavailable, slowly drowning himself in alcohol instead of seawater, but drowning nonetheless. She loved him with an intensity that bordered on worship, hanging on his pronouncements about literature and life, while he systematically destroyed his own potential. When he died suddenly in 1934 during a routine medical procedure, the loss reopened the original wound. Once again, a man she loved had vanished without warning, leaving her alone with her money and her grief. After Holmes, lovers became like exhibitions, curated, intense, temporary. She moved through them like a curator moving through galleries, seeking a permanent installation but finding only temporary loans. Samuel Beckett appeared next, the future Nobel laureate, then just a struggling Irish writer, living in Paris on the margins of Joyce's circle. Their affair was brief and unsatisfying, characterized by Beckett's emotional remoteness and Peggy's increasingly frantic attempts to provoke some reaction from a man who seemed to view human connection as a philosophical problem rather than an emotional necessity. Each man was a ghost of her father, charismatic, distant, superior, and ultimately unreachable. She was trying to fill the void of the Atlantic Ocean with bodies, trying to prove that she was worthy of being kept, even as she chose men who were constitutionally incapable of keeping her. Yet parallel to this escalating romantic chaos, something more substantial was emerging. Peggy was developing an eye, a genuine aesthetic sensibility that transcended her desperate need for male approval. She began to understand that while men were unreliable and transient, art offered a different kind of relationship, one based on possession rather than negotiation, on permanence rather than the terrifying fluidity of human emotion. A painting could not leave her. A sculpture could not choose another woman. Beauty frozen in bronze or oil could be controlled in ways that living, breathing men never could. Guided by Marcel Duchamp, who acted as her mentor and educator, she began to learn the difference between surrealism and abstract expressionism, between a masterpiece and a mistake. In January 1938, she opened Guggenheim Jeune on Cork Street in London, a gallery that would operate for only 18 months, but would establish her credentials as a serious patron rather than merely a wealthy dilettante. It was a declaration of war against the conservative British art establishment. The gallery itself was revolutionary in its design. She rejected the cluttered, salon-style hanging that characterized traditional galleries, instead mounting works on stark white walls with careful spacing and dramatic lighting that isolated each piece, forcing viewers to confront the art directly. This approach, now standard, was then radical, reflecting her instinct that modern art required a modern context. While London was still obsessed with pastoral landscapes and polite portraiture, Peggy hung drawings by Jean Cocteau and abstract geometric puzzles by Kandinsky. The critics were baffled, the public was scandalized, and she reveled in the controversy. She bought work by Kandinsky, Braque, Tanguy, Arp, and dozens of others, often for absurdly low prices, because the artists were desperate and the market was collapsing. She was not exploiting them. She was one of the few buyers still willing to purchase work that the world was actively trying to destroy. For the first time in her life, the scandal was of her own making, not something inflicted upon her by a husband or a father. She discovered a thrill in the transaction of art that sex had never truly provided. When she bought a painting, it stayed. It did not get drunk and insult her. It did not die on an operating table. It did not leave her for a younger woman. But the timing of her ascent was ominous. By 1938 and 1939, the Bohemian Party that had raged across Europe since the armistice was ending. The shadow of the swastika was lengthening across the continent. In Germany, the Nazis were burning books and labeling modern art, the very art Peggy loved, as entartete Kunst, degenerate art. They viewed the fractured perspectives of Picasso and the surreal dreams of Dahl as symptoms of racial and cultural sickness, works that needed to be purged to make way for Aryan purity. The Jewish artists whose work filled her gallery were beginning to understand that they were not merely facing aesthetic rejection, but physical annihilation. Most collectors began to retreat, hoarding their cash, looking for safe harbors. The art market collapsed. Dealers were desperate. Artists, many of whom were Jewish or political radicals, smelled the sulfur in the air and knew their time was running out. But where others saw danger, Peggy saw opportunity and perhaps a chance for redemption. She realized that the world she had adopted, the only world that had ever accepted her, was facing extinction. She closed Guggenheim Jeune after a year of financial losses but critical triumphs, her eyes turning back toward Paris as war became inevitable. It was a decision that seemed insane to her advisors. Why go toward the danger? Why take a fortune back into the mouth of the wolf? But Peggy was driven by a fervor that went beyond logic. She had spent 2 decades collecting the experiences of the avant-garde. Now, she would collect its soul. The plan was audacious to the point of madness, motivated by the same complex mixture of genuine passion and compulsive need that characterized all her relationships. She could not save the artists. Most would flee or hide or die, but she could save their work. She could possess what could not abandon her, preserve what the world wanted to destroy. There would come a moment when Peggy would race against time itself, buying a masterpiece every single day while Nazi tanks rolled toward Paris. The phrase "a picture a day" became her mantra, a rhythm of acquisition that matched the drumbeat of the approaching armies. She was no longer just decorating a home or stocking a gallery, she was building an ark. The heiress who had failed to save her father, failed to save her marriage, and failed to save herself, had finally found something she could save. And then, in 1939, as fascism consumed Europe, Peggy Guggenheim made a decision that would define her legacy. She would buy a painting a day, every day, until Paris fell, transforming herself from collector into savior of a generation's artistic soul. In the spring of 1940, as German tanks advanced on Paris, Peggy Guggenheim was in her gallery on the left bank, writing checks. While others fled for their lives, she was bargaining for Brock's, racing against oblivion itself. War does not announce itself with trumpets and fanfare. It seeps into a city like poison through the bloodstream, slow and inexorable. Paris, in those final weeks before the occupation, existed in a state of suspended animation, a metropolis holding its breath while darkness gathered on the horizon. The refugees arrived first, hollow-eyed families from Poland, Belgium, Holland, carrying suitcases that contained the compressed remnants of their former lives. They filled the train stations and cheap hotels, their whispered conversations in multiple languages, creating a babble of fear that echoed through the boulevards of Saint-Germain-des-Prés. The cafés of Montparnasse, those laboratories of cultural revolution where expatriates had spent 2 decades arguing about the nature of reality, began to empty with ominous finality. The Demi, the Rotonde, the Select, these temples of bohemian discourse fell silent as their congregants scattered to the winds. The air that had once been thick with cigarette smoke and aesthetic manifestos now carried the acrid scent of burning documents as people destroyed evidence of their political affiliations, their Jewish ancestry, their associations with the condemned art that Peggy loved with such desperate intensity. Yet she remained, moving through this dissolving world with the methodical determination of someone who had finally discovered her purpose. She had set herself a goal that bordered on magnificent insanity, to buy 1 picture a day, every day, until Paris fell. The phrase was not metaphorical but literal, a rhythm of salvation that matched the drumbeat of the approaching Wehrmacht. Each morning, she would wake in her apartment on the La St. Louis, drink her coffee to the distant wail of air raid sirens, and venture forth with her checkbook like a knight-errant, armed only with her family's copper fortune. The art market had collapsed with spectacular completeness. Dealers who had once been imperious gatekeepers, deciding which works deserved wall space in their sacred galleries, were now desperate men looking to liquidate inventory before it could be confiscated or fed to the bonfires that the Nazis had promised to light. Artists whose names would one day command millions were selling their life's work for the price of a train ticket to Lisbon or a bribe for a border guard. It was a fire sale at the end of the world, and Peggy moved through it like a woman possessed by a vision that transcended mere collecting. She bought a Fernand Lurger in the morning, geometric figures frozen in industrial precision, and a Salvador Dal in the afternoon, its melting clocks a prophetic commentary on time running out. She acquired mirrors whose playful biomorphic forms would soon be labeled degenerate by a regime that demanded art be as rigid and unimaginative as its ideology. She purchased works by Braque, Picasso, Kandinsky, Klee, a roll call of the avant-garde that Hitler had explicitly sworn to eradicate from the face of the earth. Each transaction was both a rescue and a form of grave robbing, saving masterpieces from destruction while profiting from the desperation of their creators. The profound irony of her situation was inescapable and terrifying. Peggy herself was Jewish, her name synonymous with the international Jewish capital that Nazi propaganda blamed for every catastrophe, from the Great War to the stock market crash. She was precisely the kind of person the approaching regime would target with methodical enthusiasm, wealthy, cosmopolitan, culturally sophisticated, and racially condemned. Her very presence in Paris was an act of suicidal defiance, yet she seemed strangely insulated from the terror that paralyzed everyone around her. Her obsession with the art had become a psychological armor, a shield that kept the reality of her own mortal danger at bay. The sensory experience of those final weeks was a collision of beauty and apocalypse that would haunt her for the rest of her life. The smell of fresh oil paint mixed with the smoke of burning libraries. The silence of empty galleries was punctuated by the mechanical wail of sirens and the distant thunder of artillery testing its range. The light of the Parisian spring, usually so forgiving and golden, seemed harsh and exposing, illuminating the fear in the eyes of dealers who handed over their treasures with trembling fingers. She would stand before a canvas, evaluating its composition and provenance while calculating how to transport it, how to hide it, how to keep it safe from the barbarians who were measuring the distance to the capital in kilometers and hours. By early June, she had amassed over 150 works, paintings, sculptures, drawings, that represented nothing less than the compressed soul of 20th century artistic revolution. But possession was only half the challenge. Preservation was the other. As the French government prepared to flee to Bordeaux and panic seized the city like a fever, Peggy faced the logistical nightmare of moving tons of fragile canvas and bronze out of a war zone that was rapidly becoming a death trap. In an act of desperate optimism, she approached the curators of the Louvre, asking them to store her collection alongside the Mona Lisa and the Winged Victory in their secret country hiding places. The response was both predictable and devastating. These conservative guardians of classical beauty looked at her Kandinskys and Elgars with undisguised contempt, informing her that such works were not art in any meaningful sense, and therefore did not merit precious space in the trucks fleeing the capital. It was a rejection that crystallized her mission with brutal clarity. The establishment would not save this art. The museums would not save it. If these works were to survive the coming darkness, it would be because she, and she alone, had the vision and the courage to preserve them. With German advance units days away from the capital, she hired a truck and packed the collection herself, wrapping canvases in blankets and sheets with the tenderness she had never quite managed to show to living beings. She joined the great exodus flowing south from Paris, her vehicle indistinguishable from thousands of others clogging the roads, except that while others carried furniture and family photographs, she was transporting the intellectual Dina of modernism itself. She found temporary sanctuary in a barn in the French countryside, where masterpieces worth millions were stacked against rough wooden walls and covered with hay to disguise their true nature. The image was biblical in its absurdity. Picassos and Pollocks resting in agricultural dust, hidden beneath straw like contraband, while the boots of occupying soldiers marched on the roads outside. It was a perfect metaphor for the collision between high culture and barbarism, between the refined visions of artists and the crude reality of mechanized conquest. The danger was not theoretical. The Nazis had established special units dedicated to the systematic plunder of Jewish art collections, hunting for exactly the kind of cachet Peggy had assembled. Had they discovered the barn, the works would have been seized and likely burned in public bonfires of degenerate art, while Peggy herself would have been arrested and transported east to a fate she preferred not to contemplate. Yet she stayed until the very last possible moment, gambling her life against her obsession, refusing to leave until she had secured the impossible, an export license for her contraband masterpieces. Her final masterstroke was a deception of such audacious simplicity that it bordered on genius. She convinced a French official, whether through sympathy, bribery, or simple bureaucratic exhaustion, to sign papers listing her collection not as priceless art but as personal effects. The crates were labeled household goods and described as containing linens, crockery, bedding, the mundane detritus of domestic life. Inside those innocuous containers were the dreams of the surrealists, the fractured realities of the cubists, the abstract spiritualism of the expressionists, smuggled out of Europe, disguised as casserole dishes and bedsheets. The physical act of saving the art had become a proxy for all the emotional salvation she had never been able to achieve. She could not save her father from the Atlantic. She could not save her marriage from violence. She could not save her lovers from their own self-destructive demons. But she could save this. She could take these fragile, beautiful objects and carry them across an ocean, away from the fires of Europe, to a place where they could continue to exist and inspire future generations. It was perhaps the purest love she was capable of giving, a love that demanded nothing in return but survival. During these final months in France, she also made one last impulsive romantic decision that would complicate her escape. She married Max Ernst, the German surrealist painter, whose blue eyes and mythic imagery had captivated her imagination. The marriage was partly strategic. Ernst was desperate to escape Europe, and marriage to an American citizen offered a path to survival. But it was also emotional, another iteration of her compulsive need to bind herself to difficult, charismatic men who embodied the artistic genius she worshipped. Ernst was already involved with Leonora Carrington, a British artist who would later accuse Peggy of theft. But in the chaos of France's collapse, such conventional considerations seemed almost trivial. When she finally boarded a Pan Am clipper in Lisbon in July 1941, she was exhausted in a way that transcended physical fatigue. She had spent more than a year living at the intersection of art and apocalypse, gambling her life for objects that could not love her back, but would never abandon her either. The collection had preceded her across the Atlantic, already safe in storage in New York, waiting for her to decide what to do with the fragments of a civilization that had been systematically murdered. As the flying boat descended toward New York Harbor, she looked down at the city rising from the water like a promise of reinvention. The Europe she loved, the bohemian paradise where she had been free to fail and experiment and discover herself, was gone forever, replaced by a nightmare of occupation and genocide. The cafes of Montparnasse were silent or filled with conquerors. The studios were empty or repurposed for propaganda. The artists she had known were dead, in hiding, or scattered across the globe like seeds from a burned garden. She had escaped to America in 1941 with her collection intact, but the resonance of that victory was double-edged. She had saved the art, but she had lost the world that created it. She possessed the masterpieces, but the men who painted them were gone. The sanctuary she had built in Europe had been shattered by history's boot, and now she faced the challenge of building another. The woman who stepped off the clipper was no longer the awkward heiress who had fled to Paris 20 years earlier. She was a smuggler, a savior, a curator of civilization's fragments. And she would build a new sanctuary in the one city that never stopped believing in excess, New York. In October 1942, Peggy Guggenheim opened the most radical gallery New York had ever seen. The art world was scandalized, the critics were appalled, and Peggy had never been happier or more alone. The return to America was not a homecoming, but an invasion. Peggy arrived in Manhattan, carrying the avant-garde like a virus she intended to release into the bloodstream of a culture still obsessed with regionalism and polite abstraction. New York in the early 1940s was a city swollen with refugees, not only of war, but of culture. Artists, writers, and intellectuals who had fled the catastrophe of Europe arrived with battered suitcases and broken accents, bringing with them ideas that America had never fully taken seriously. Into this volatile mixture of money, trauma, and ambition, Peggy inserted herself with the certainty of someone who believed that history owed her another act. She rented space at 30 West 57th Street, 2 converted tailor shops on the top floor of a nondescript building, nestled among the conservative galleries that had spent decades selling safe landscapes to safe collectors. But there was nothing safe about what she had created. She commissioned Friedrich Kiesler, an Austrian architect and visionary refugee, to design a space that would be as revolutionary as the art it contained. What he delivered was not a gallery, but a fever dream made architectural, a spatial manifesto that declared war on every convention of how art should be displayed and experienced. The result, christened Art of this Century, was a hallucination constructed in wood and canvas. The walls were curved, concave surfaces made of gumwood that seemed to breathe and shift, rejecting the rigid geometry of bourgeois interiors. Paintings did not hang on walls, they floated. Works were suspended from the ceiling on invisible cables or mounted on biomorphic wooden arms that jutted from the walls like strange organic growths, each canvas isolated in its own territory of space and light. In the Surrealist gallery, unframed paintings protruded from curved wooden arms that extended into the room like the limbs of some mechanical creature, while the lighting flickered and shifted in rhythmic pulses controlled by switches that could make a canvas explode into brightness or retreat into shadow. The abstract gallery was even more radical. Here, paintings were suspended on ropes and wires, hanging in mid-air like geometric ghosts, their frames eliminated to emphasize the raw materiality of canvas and paint. Visitors walked through a forest of floating rectangles, the works surrounding them in 3 dimensions rather than presenting themselves as passive objects on a wall. The floor was turquoise, the ceiling was black, and the overall effect was of entering another dimension where the normal rules of gravity and perspective had been temporarily suspended. There was also a kinetic gallery where motorized sculptures slowly rotated, their shadows dancing across the walls, and most controversially, a daylight gallery with natural illumination and stark white walls, a space that seems conventional now but was then considered dangerously modern. The opening night on October 20th was a calculated assault on the senses and sensibilities of New York society. Peggy greeted guests wearing her signature mismatched earrings, one designed by Alexander Calder, a delicate mobile that swayed with her movements, the other by Yves Tanguy, a surrealist sculpture that looked like it had been excavated from some alien landscape. The asymmetry was deliberate, a visual declaration that she refused to be bound by conventional notions of harmony or taste. She moved through the crowd like its ringmaster, cultivating her own image as carefully as she curated her shows, standing at the center of her creation like a high priestess of the absurd. New York society did not know what to make of it. Critics who had spent careers defending representational art wandered through the galleries in stunned silence, unsure whether they were witnessing genius or elaborate fraud. They called it a circus, a nightclub, a vulgar spectacle, a nightmare, a lunatic asylum. The New York Times was cautiously respectful, but clearly baffled. Society matrons, wrapped in mink and entitlement, walked in expecting to see polite culture, and walked out in visible disgust, whispering to each other about the inappropriateness of the nudes, the incomprehensibility of the abstractions, the general atmosphere of chaos that pervaded the space. But the younger generation of artists and critics recognized that something genuinely new had arrived in Manhattan, a space that treated modern art not as a curiosity to be tolerated, but as the central artistic achievement of the age. For Peggy, every insult was a confirmation. To scandalize was to matter. To be dismissed by the establishment was to know you had hit the nerve that guarded its deepest anxieties. The gallery quickly became the epicenter of the New York avant-garde, a sanctuary where European exiles collided with American hopefuls. It was here that European surrealists fleeing the war, Ernst, Breton, Duchamp, Masson, collided with young American painters searching for a new language. This collision produced the spark that would ignite abstract expressionism, shifting the center of the art world from Paris to New York for the first time in history. Her greatest discovery, the one that would cement her legacy as more than just a wealthy collector, was Jackson Pollock. He was a troubled alcoholic from Wyoming, 30 years old and completely unknown, working as a carpenter and janitor while painting in obscurity. His work was violent and chaotic, drips and splatters that seemed to reject every convention of composition and technique. Most dealers dismissed him as incompetent, a man who couldn't draw, and therefore resorted to throwing paint at canvas. But when Peggy first saw his painting's stenographic figure, despite her initial skepticism, Piet Mondrian told her, "I think this is the most interesting work I've seen so far in America." Trusting his judgment over her own initial reaction, she did what she had always done when confronted with potential genius trapped in material precarity. She opened her checkbook. She offered Pollock a monthly stipend of $150, a pittance by Guggenheim standards, but salvation to a man accustomed to scraping by on odd jobs and the charity of friends. She commissioned him to paint a mural for the entrance hall of her townhouse, a canvas nearly 20 feet long that forced him to break through the limitations of easel painting and discover the rhythmic, all-over style that would define his career. She gave him his first solo exhibition in November 1943 and championed him with a ferocity that bordered on maternal obsession. She made him famous, transforming an unknown alcoholic into the most important American painter of his generation. But success, as always in Peggy's life, contained the seeds of its own dissolution. As Pollock's reputation grew, so did his market value and his ego. He became too expensive for her to continue supporting, too famous to need her patronage, too difficult to manage as his alcoholism spiraled into violence and paranoia. She watched him move beyond her reach, signed by more powerful dealers who could offer him the kind of institutional validation she could never provide. It was another abandonment, another man who left once he no longer needed what she could offer. While she was reshaping the cultural landscape of the 20th century, her personal life remained a catastrophe of Shakespearean proportions. Her marriage to Max Ernst, which had been partly strategic and partly romantic, collapsed with predictable brutality. Ernst had never truly loved her. She was his ticket out of Europe, a means of survival rather than an object of genuine affection. Once they were safely in New York, he began an affair with Dorothea Tanning, a young American painter, whom Peggy had ironically included in an exhibition of women artists. The final humiliation was perfect and cruel. Peggy had provided the platform for the woman who would steal her husband. Ernst left her with the casual cruelty of a man who had never pretended to be anything other than what he was. But the deepest wound, the one that would fester for the rest of her life, concerned her children. Sindbad and Pegeen, her son and daughter from her marriage to Lawrence Vale, had been raised in the chaotic aftermath of their parents' divorce, shuttled between continents and caretakers, while Peggy pursued her twin obsessions with art and men. They were neglected not through malice, but through the simple fact that she was constitutionally incapable of providing the kind of stable, nurturing environment that children require. She loved them in her way, but her way was inadequate to the task of motherhood. Pegeen was particularly damaged, a sensitive girl who inherited her mother's insecurity without the compensating armor of wealth and defiance. She painted scenes of childlike innocence that barely concealed a profound melancholy, images of women and children trapped in beautiful, suffocating spaces. Her mental health deteriorated throughout the 40s, a slow-motion tragedy that played out against the backdrop of gallery openings and cocktail parties. In 1967, at the age of 42, Pegeen would die of an overdose in Paris, in circumstances officially ruled accidental, but whispered to be suicide. Peggy would be haunted by the agonizing knowledge that she could preserve canvases across oceans and wars, but she could not preserve her own child. Art of this century operated for 5 years, from 1942 to 1947, a brief but incandescent period that transformed the American art world. Peggy mounted 71 exhibitions, introduced New York to the European avant-garde, discovered and promoted the abstract expressionists who would dominate the next generation, and created a template for how modern art should be displayed and experienced. She proved that a woman could be a serious curator, that money could be deployed in service of genuine vision rather than mere social climbing, that risk-taking in art could produce rewards that transcended financial calculation. But America had never truly accepted her. She was too Jewish for the Protestant establishment, too sexual for a culture that still demanded women perform modesty and restraint, too free in her opinions and lifestyle for a society that valued conformity above almost everything else. The uncles who ran the Guggenheim empire viewed her with a mixture of embarrassment and condescension, uncomfortable with her bohemian associations and her refusal to play the role of respectable heiress. The critics who praised her gallery often did so with a tone of surprise, as if they couldn't quite believe that a woman, and a Jewish woman at that, could possess genuine aesthetic judgment. By 1947, the energy that had sustained art of this century began to dissipate. The war was over. The European artists were returning home or establishing their own careers independent of her patronage. The American painters she had championed were being picked up by more commercial galleries, their prices rising beyond what she was willing to pay. The art world was becoming professionalized and sanitized, losing the chaotic, amateur spirit that Peggy thrived on. She was exhausted in a way that went beyond physical fatigue, depleted by decades of living at maximum intensity, by the constant battles with critics, the endless financial demands of artists, the failure of her marriages, the tragedy of her children. She realized that her work in New York was done. She had injected the virus of modernism into the American bloodstream. The infection had taken hold, and the patient would never be the same. The center of gravity had shifted. Pollock was famous. Abstract expressionism was the new language of power. She was no longer needed as a midwife to the revolution, because the revolution had won. The very success of the gallery was eroding her role within it, transforming her from visionary into historical footnote. And so she made the decision to close the gallery and return to the continent that had always felt more like home. She packed her collection once again, now expanded to include the American giants she had discovered, and looked toward Venice. She wanted a place where she could live with her art, rather than just sell it, a place where time moved differently, where the past and present coexisted in melancholic harmony. By 1947, Peggy was exhausted. She had given New York the future of art, but America had never truly accepted her. Too Jewish, too sexual, too free. And so she returned to Europe, to Venice, to the unfinished palazzo, where she would spend the last 30 years of her life, becoming a living monument to her own magnificent ruin. Peggy Guggenheim died in 1979, and the art world mourned not the woman, but the collection. Because in the end, that was her true legacy, not the men she loved, not the children she failed, but the paintings she refused to let the world forget. Today, the Palazzo Venier dei Leoni sits on the Grand Canal as a pristine white anomaly among Venice's Gothic towers, its single story a permanent reminder of incompletion. The palazzo was intended to rise 4 floors in the 18th century, but construction stopped abruptly after the first level, leaving it forever truncated, the Palazzo Non Finito, the unfinished palace. It became the perfect sanctuary for a woman whose own life would remain similarly incomplete, a fragment that somehow achieved more significance than many finished monuments. Tourists drift through its white rooms with audio guides pressed to their ears, their voices hushed in the reverence that museums demand. They pause before Pollocks that still crackle with chaotic energy, study Picassos whose fractured faces continue to challenge perception, marvel at Dal's melting clocks that render time meaningless. These visitors see the brass plaques bearing names that have solidified into artistic immortality: Kandinsky, Mir, Ernst, Braque, unaware that when Peggy first wrote these names in her checkbook, the world considered them mad, immoral, or simply irrelevant. She had lived in this sanctuary for 30 years, gradually becoming as much a fixture of Venice as the palazzo itself. The eccentric American heiress who wore butterfly-shaped sunglasses and mismatched earrings, who kept 14 Lhasa Apso dogs that followed her through the galleries like a devoted congregation, who received visitors in her garden beneath a Murino Marini sculpture whose bronze phallus could be. detached when nuns passed by on the canal. She cultivated her legend with the same precision she had once applied to her exhibitions, transforming herself into performance art, a living monument to bohemian defiance. But beneath the carefully constructed eccentricity lay a profound loneliness that no amount of attention could alleviate. Her final years were marked by the gradual shutdown of her sensory apparatus. Thick spectacles became necessary prosthetics against failing vision. Hearing aids struggled to compensate for increasing deafness. She moved through her palazzo in a wheelchair, surrounded by masterpieces she could no longer properly see, listening to conversations she could no longer fully hear. The irony was exquisite and merciless. The woman who had spent her life trying to be seen was slowly losing the ability to see. The profound tragedy of Pigeon's death in 1967 haunted these final years like a ghost that refused to be exorcised. Her daughter had died of an overdose in Paris at 42, in circumstances officially ruled accidental but whispered to be suicide. For Peggy, it was the ultimate failure, the devastating proof that she could preserve canvases across oceans and wars, but could not preserve her own child. The guilt sat in the palazzo like another piece of art, invisible but omnipresent, a weight that no amount of Picasso's could balance. She spent her entire life trying to be loved, trying to be seen, trying to matter. She believed, with the desperate, magical thinking of the traumatized, that if she could possess beautiful things, art, men, experiences, she would finally feel whole. Each painting purchased, each affair embarked upon, each scandal courted was a move in the same frantic game, prove that she deserved to exist. But the devastating truth that emerged only in the silence of her final years was that the art she collected had outlived her, outlasted her, and ultimately defined her more than any human relationship ever could. Her palazzo remains unfinished, just like her life. She never completed the upper floors, never built the dynasty her family name seemed to promise. But she saved some of the 20th century's greatest art from destruction. She gave Jackson Pollock his start when no one else believed in him. She preserved the legacy of surrealism and abstract expressionism when the world wanted to burn it all. The unfinished building stands not as a symbol of failure, but of priorities. She chose to complete her collection rather than her house, chose the eternal over the temporal. In the palazzo's small garden, away from the crowds that swarm the galleries, lies her grave. It is a simple stone marker, unpretentious and quiet, surrounded by the graves of her 14 beloved dogs, Cappuccino, Peacock, Emily, Sir Herbert. Here is the final truth of her heart. She chose to spend eternity not with the great men of history, not with the artists she made famous, but with the creatures who offered her unconditional love. The dogs did not care about her money or her nose or her family name. They simply loved her. In burying herself among them, she made a silent statement about the nature of loyalty and the failure of human connection. The visitors who pause at her grave rarely linger. They are there for the art, not the woman. But occasionally, someone will read the simple marker and contemplate the strange trajectory of a life that began in a Fifth Avenue townhouse and ended in an unfinished Venetian palazzo, that survived the sinking of the Titanic and the fall of Paris, that collected lovers and paintings with equal fervor and unequal success. Money can build ships, palaces, dynasties. Time sinks them all. The Titanic rests on the ocean floor, a monument to hubris. The copper mines that financed her grandfather's empire are exhausted scars on the landscape. The great family fortune has been dispersed and diluted. But sometimes, in the brief interval between disaster and oblivion, a single wounded soul like Peggy Guggenheim gathers enough fragments of genius to defy the water for a little longer. She lived a life of scandalous imperfection to preserve a perfect beauty. The affairs were messy, the marriages were disasters, the motherhood was inadequate, the loneliness was profound. But the collection was immaculate. Every painting was chosen with genuine vision. Every sculpture represented a moment of aesthetic breakthrough. In her unfinished palace, she finally found the one thing her fortune could never buy: immortality. Not for herself, but for the art she saved from the flames. The paintings remain. The lovers are forgotten. Lawrence Vale is a footnote in Dadaist history. Samuel Beckett is remembered for his plays, not for his brief affair with a wealthy American. Max Ernst is celebrated for his art, not for his marriage to his patron. But the collection endures, visited by hundreds of thousands each year, inspiring new generations who see in those canvases permission to break rules and pursue visions that conventional society finds threatening. And perhaps that is enough. Perhaps that is the only collection that matters. The beautiful things we save from oblivion, the masterpieces we guard against time's relentless tide. She was the custodian of a generation's dreams, the guardian of visions that dared to see the world differently. The water of the Grand Canal laps against the palazzo's foundations, patient and relentless, slowly reclaiming the city. Venice is sinking, eventually destined to return to the lagoon. But for now, in this brief interval between creation and dissolution, the paintings hang in perfect light, preserved against the tide. That preservation, that defiant gesture against oblivion, is Peggy Guggenheim's true masterpiece, the unfinished symphony she composed not with notes but with canvases, not with love, but with the only kind of immortality that ever really works.